Part 2. The Second Dispersion. Judah's Journey Southward and the Transatlantic Passage. We have followed Ephraim northward, through Assyria, through Scythia, through the Celtic peoples of Europe, across the Atlantic. We have watched the younger brother surpass the elder, exactly as Jacob's crossed hands prophesied. Now we turn to the second stream, Judah, the southern kingdom, the tribe of the Davidic throne and the temple, the people through whom the Messiah would come. Their dispersion moves in the opposite direction, not northward and westward, southward, into Africa, and then across the Atlantic in chains. Moses had written a word over Israel approximately 1400 years before it happened, a word so specific, so precise, so forensically accurate in its detail that it strains every naturalistic explanation. Deuteronomy chapter 28. The chapter most scholars have read as a general warning about covenant disobedience, but when you lay it against the history of the transatlantic slave trade, verse by verse, what you find is not a general warning. What you find is a prophecy. The second dispersion of Judah begins in 70 AD, not with the slave ships, but with the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Moses had written it in Deuteronomy 28, verse 49. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand. The Roman eagle, the Aquila, the very standard carried at the front of every Roman legion, was carried into the ruins of the temple. The soldiers spoke Latin, entirely unintelligible to the Judean population. Every detail of Moses' description was present. The historian Josephus, an eyewitness, documents over 1 million deaths during the fall of Jerusalem and approximately 97,000 taken captive. Josephus explicitly records that the surviving Jewish prisoners were distributed throughout the Roman Empire as slaves. The Bar Kokhba revolt of 135 AD produced a second wave of mass enslavement. Over 100,000 additional captives taken by Tacitus and Cassius Dio's accounts, and then a final act of administrative erasure. The province was officially renamed Syria Palestina, specifically to sever the connection to the name Judea, to obliterate Judean identity itself from the map. But you cannot erase a people by renaming their geography. You cannot break a covenant by suppressing a name. The sifting of Judah had begun, and like the sifting of Ephraim before it, not one grain would fall to the ground. After the catastrophes of 70 and 135 AD, the dispersion of Judah moved southward and eastward. The historian Rudolph R. Windsor documents that during the period from Pompey to Julius Caesar, it has been estimated that over 1 million Jews fled into Africa to escape Roman persecution and slavery. Jesus himself had explicitly instructed his disciples to flee to the mountains when they saw Jerusalem surrounded. From Judea, refugees moved into the established Jewish communities of Alexandria and Cyrene, documented since the Ptolemaic period. From North Africa, the dispersion moved along multiple corridors, westward along the Mediterranean coast through the Maghreb, southward down the Nile into Ethiopia and the Sudan, and over centuries, deeper into the African interior, into the Sahel, into West Africa, along the trans-Saharan trade routes. In the medieval period, Jewish communities, or communities bearing unmistakable Hebraic cultural markers, were documented throughout West Africa by Arab geographers and historians who had no theological interest in their findings. The same God who directed Ephraim northward and westward was directing Judah southward, positioning the southern stream at the precise point from which the second transatlantic crossing would occur. Not by coincidence, not by accident of empire, by sovereign design. The evidence of Judah's presence in West Africa is not confined to genetic markers. It is written into the cultural memory of multiple West African peoples, independently in communities separated by hundreds of miles, who had no contact with each other's testimony. The Igbo people of Nigeria preserve circumcision on the 8th day, Sabbath observance, dietary restrictions aligned with Torah law, a creation narrative remarkably parallel to Genesis, and a naming tradition that includes Hebraic names appearing before any missionary contact. The Ashanti of Ghana carry clan names and cultural memories traceable to Israelite origin, preserved in oral tradition across generations. The Lemba people of southern Africa, living in South Africa and Zimbabwe, preserve oral traditions of Hebrew origin, practice circumcision, maintain dietary restrictions aligned with Torah law, observe a Sabbath-like day of rest, and carry specific cultural memory of migration from the north, from a place they call Senna. And when modern geneticists tested the Lemba's Y chromosome DNA, looking specifically for the Cohen modal haplotype, the genetic marker associated with Jewish priestly lineages, they found it at rates comparable to Ashkenazi Jewish populations. In a community geographically separated from Ashkenazi Jews by entire continents and over 2,000 years. The grain was scattered across Africa, but the seed within the grain, the invisible covenant code, was preserved intact. The Cohen modal haplotype is more than a genetic curiosity. It is a molecular testimony. This specific Y chromosome marker, found among Jewish priestly lineages, among Cohens and Levites, appears in Ashkenazi Jewish populations at approximately 50 to 60% among male Cohens. That rate is itself remarkable, but what makes it prophetically significant is where else it appears. The same marker appears in the Lemba people of southern Africa at comparable rates. Two communities, separated by entire continents, separated by over 2,000 years of geographic isolation, carrying the same specific genetic signature. There is no cultural explanation for this. There is no missionary explanation. There is no coincidence that produces this result. The only explanation consistent with all the evidence is biological descent from a common ancestral population, the Judean priestly lineage. In every male descendant of the priestly line who carries this marker, the DNA itself is a record, preserved not in ink or parchment, but in the double helix of every cell. The genetic code is the visible expression of the invisible seed. When the Lemba preserve this haplotype at rates identical to Jewish priestly populations, despite being geographically separated for over 2,000 years, they are testifying to what Amos promised. Not one grain shall fall to the ground. The grain was dispersed, the seed was preserved, and when science finally decoded the molecular language God had written into his people, it revealed the truth that faith had known all along. The most sobering section of the two dispersion framework is the correspondence between the curse sequence of Deuteronomy chapter 28 and the documented history of the transatlantic slave trade. Moses wrote these words as warnings of what would befall Israel in the event of covenant disobedience. They were written approximately 1,400 years before the Roman siege, approximately 3,000 years before the slave ships sailed. And the correspondence between what Moses wrote and what history recorded is not approximate. It is precise. Verse 32, "Your sons and daughters shall be given to another people." History records families systematically separated at American slave auctions. Parents and children sold to different owners on the same day. Verse 36, "A nation which neither thou nor thy fathers have known." History records transportation to the Americas, a land unknown to any prior generation of the captives. Verse 48, "He shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck." History records literal iron collars, chains, and manacles throughout the American slave system. And then, verse 68, perhaps the most specific verse in all of Scripture, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, by a way whereof I spoke unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." The original Egypt was a type, bondage under foreign power, in a strange land, with the name and identity of the captive people deliberately suppressed. The words "again with ships" point to a second, greater bondage reached by sea. No event in human history matches this description with the precision of the transatlantic slave trade. The peoples transported from the Judah coast of West Africa arrived in a land their fathers had never known, speaking languages not their own, stripped of their names, their religious identity, their family structures, their tribal memory, exactly as Deuteronomy 28 had written, 3,000 years before it happened. There is something that must be said about the severity of what happened to Judah in the transatlantic slave trade. The ferocity of the destruction, the deliberate erasure of family, language, name, religion, and memory, was not random. It was not the ordinary cruelty of empire. It was strategic, it was total, and its totality is itself evidence. Satan does not deploy his most extreme measures against ordinary targets. The depth of the wound is proportional to the threat the enemy perceived in the recognition that had not yet come. The severity of chattel slavery in America, the specific, systematic, multi-generational nature of its assault on identity, is the fingerprint of an enemy who knew exactly who Judah was, even when Judah had forgotten. But here is the word that must be said over that wound. The God who wrote the curse also wrote the promise of restoration. The God who allowed the wound is the same God who promised the healing. The sifting was total, both dispersions, north and south, Ephraim and Judah, encompassed in a single verse of Amos chapter 9. And the preservation is equally total. Not one grain is lost to God's purposes. The scattering was the distribution of the seed, and the God who scattered with precision will gather with the same precision. Both streams, both families, one soil, one nation under God. Chapter 4 has given us the second stream, Judah's journey, southward through Rome, into Africa, and across the Atlantic in chains. The Roman eagle fulfilled Moses' prophecy about the eagle nation from afar. The slave ships fulfilled his prophecy about Egypt again with ships. The iron manacles fulfilled his prophecy about the iron yoke. Moses wrote it 1400 years before Rome, 3,000 years before the slave trade, and every detail was present. The wound was real, the suffering was total, the erasure was deliberate and systematic, and the preservation was sovereign and complete. Not one grain fell to the ground uncounted. The seed within the grain, written into the DNA of every descendant, was carried across the Atlantic and preserved on American soil. Ephraim from the north and west, Judah from the south, both streams arriving at the same shore. In chapter 5, we will discover what Isaiah saw when he looked at this convergence. America as the banner nation, the ensign raised for all the nations of the earth, and the prophetic warning buried in Isaiah 11:13 that this nation must urgently hear. One seed, two families, one nation under God. The key is still in your hand. Let us keep reading.